Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. This is a weird microphone. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. Hello. Oh, I'm not tapping on the mic, I can't do it. Okay, we're gonna go ahead and get started on our last session. Maybe we'll just skip my presentation. Does the mic sound okay? Because it sounds kind of funny up here, but it might just be an echo in my head. Does it sound okay to everybody? Okay, good. All right, well, thanks for sticking it out with me. This is not the closing plenary, in case anybody thought it was. I'm not giving out the Tetris lamp. That will be in the next hour. But if you don't mind sticking with me for what'll probably be just about 45 minutes, you are in the right room to possibly win that Tetris lamp, which I'm just fascinated by. So thanks for sticking it out. My name is Ahlbrand, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about arguments for visual aids in the classroom. If we want to use the wave analogy that we've been using throughout the conference, visual aids are nothing new. That wave's been rolling for a long time. We should be using them in the classroom. Lots of people have hopped on. They are surfing those waves right now. But there are a lot of people that are still standing on shore. And so I want to let people know that the water is fine and you should dive right in. Is that enough of an analogy for us about driving the wave? I really like analogies. Okay, so 3 hours. It's not how long I plan to talk, I promise. That's a bad joke, but it is about the maximum amount of time that my colleagues and I get in our first year legal research and writing class for an entire academic year to teach the basic legal research process to 1Ls. It's not a lot of time. We are guest lectures 4 times throughout the entire school year. We get a lecture for cases, a lecture for statutes, a lecture for secondary sources where we focus on American law reports and legal encyclopedias, and a final lecture where we speed through legal periodicals and periodical indexes, and then we're expected to review everything in that last lecture as well. So it's not a lot of time, and you have to be creative. Now, I've only been around for I've been around for 29 years. I've only been a law librarian for 2 years, and I don't have any real education in teaching, so I'm just sort of self-taught, like most of us are. And so I've wondered throughout my 8 lectures, I guess I've done for 1Ls now, what can I do differently? Because I'll go through my first lectures, and everything makes sense to them in the fall when I do cases and statutes. And like most LRW classes, I think we are on different fake client files, right? So they'll be on maybe client B by the time they get to me in October. And I talk to them about cases and statutes. Everything seems to be clicking for them. And then client C comes around and they say, well, now what do I do? Now I had a whole conversation about this with a math instructor at Indiana University, and where I work, by the way. And she said, well, that's the same problem I have. It really just comes down to word problems. And a client file sounds like it's the same thing as, Jimmy has 6 pebbles and he gives 2 to Sarah. How many does he have left? If Jimmy suddenly has 7 pebbles, or instead of pebbles, they're now cupcakes, and he gives 3 to Sarah, all of a sudden the students don't know what to do, right? So really, who's giving away any cupcakes? Come on now. Pebbles are much easier to give away. But it does. It comes down to word problems. And so I've tried to puzzle through it in my first year, and I played around a little bit with PowerPoint for each of my lectures. So I'd have a PowerPoint specifically about cases and a PowerPoint specifically about statutes. And again, I was still just having this word problem. So in my second year of teaching, I still did the same thing in the fall because it's cases and statutes, and then 3 months later I come back in and talk about secondary sources. But for my last lecture, when I had to do a review, I thought, I think the problem here is that they're not getting the big picture. They're so mired down in all the different ways they can find cases, and what's the difference between an annotated and an unannotated code, and wait, what was a legal encyclopedia? American jurisprudence, what was I supposed to look for? That they're not seeing that with every client file, it's the same process. So I tried a Prezi. I know there have been a lot of Prezi haters at the conference. Let me go ahead and be controversial. I love Prezi. I also love PowerPoint. And if you use any tool right, It can do wonderful things in the classroom. It's just knowing how to use the technology and to use it well. And that's what I want to focus on today. So if you were in Aaron DeWald's lovely lecture yesterday, you're going to hear a little repeat of the cognitive science, because I was really excited about it when I read about it this semester when I was trying to justify why I use visual aids in the classroom. So I'm going to share it with you in case you weren't there. I won't be quite as eloquent as Aaron because I am not a fifth-year PhD student in any of this. I am just self-taught. But the way I understand it, first of all, using visual aids in the classroom aids your memory. And it comes down to how the right brain and the left brain work. So in a typical law school classroom, and I apologize, I will be overgeneralizing the law school curriculum today. I recognize that many professors are doing wonderful things in the classroom. I also know that many professors can lecture very well. They can give a straight lecture that's perfectly engaging and wonderful. But I don't think that's the majority. So I'm going to talk about what I consider to be the typical classroom, which I think is still just a non-visual, straight stand and deliver lecture that might have a little bit of Socratic with it. But if you add just some visuals, some relevant visuals to your lecture, it gives the right brain something to do. So the left brain can take in that lecture really well. It takes in little bits of data and absorbs those very well. The right brain takes those little bits of data from the left brain and connects them together and can create concepts and can visualize what's going on. So if you have a visual that goes along with your lecture, that's when the right brain clicks in. And it helps the memory because it helps you retain the information better, and even more, it helps you recall it later for an examination or for practical application. And then there are the learning styles. Now, we've heard about our visual learners. We've heard about our verbal learners. And from what I can read, actually, and I should read a little bit more about it, it seems to be kind of a contested issue. I think there are different theories of learning styles out there, but the one that I kept coming up with in my reading were these 6. So the ones in the left column are ones that in a typical law school classroom, they're fed pretty well. So a verbal learner learns well by reading all the cases beforehand and taking notes on them. The oral learner learns well by talking it out. So in like the Socratic method, an oral learner's learning really well. Or if they go in after class and talk out an issue in the professor's office hours, that's when they're really getting it. And then there's the, I don't know how to differentiate this, the oral learner who learns best by listening in a lecture format. But then there's the 3 on the right side of our table. The kinesthetic learner and the tactile learner are pretty similar. Kinesthetic, you learn best by acting out, or acting out a situation, not acting out violently or something. Maybe, I don't know, to each his own. But even in a typical classroom, if you come into a class and the professor throws a hypo on the board and then divides the class into 3 groups, a third of you are going to be prosecutors, a third are going to be defense, and a third are going to be judges. And then those little pockets of people are going to have to discuss amongst themselves and sort of act out what their arguments would be about this hypothetical, right? And then the judges have to confer and decide who won the hypothetical, who won the case. That would work for a kinesthetic learner. It also will work pretty well for a tactile learner who learns well by feeling. So for that, I always think about like medical students who are actually in the trenches, they're working with patients. Or law students who are in trial advocacy courses or clinics doing practical education. That's where kinesthetic and tactile learners learn very well. And then there's the visual learners who learn best by pictures. Now, I thought I'd be coming into this saying, oh, there's these poor visual learners, and they're falling behind in class because most of our lectures are just straight lectures. They don't have a lot of visuals. And so we need to put visuals in the classroom to help those students. But as it turns out, visuals help everyone. It doesn't matter what kind of a learner you are, because it goes, again, back to the right brain and the left brain. Everybody's right brain and left brain works the same way. They're all powered so that the right brain is doing the visual and the left brain is taking in the bits of data. So even if you are a verbal learner or an oral learner, you're still going to learn best if you have the visuals in the classroom. But you do have to use them well. And then finally, my big argument for them is that visuals do help with the big picture. If you're using your visuals right, they are going to help the students get the big picture. And that's what I've tried to do at the end of this semester with my first-year students, and what I will be doing in the fall semester from the very beginning, even with an introductory lecture on cases, I'm still going to start with the whole legal research process and where cases fit into it. Because I think, and I have no empirical evidence on this because I've only been teaching for 2 years, but I hypothesize that if I start with the big picture early, even if my entire lecture is just going to be about cases, I think they're going to start grasping how everything plays together if I start with the big picture early. So maybe I'll come back to Cali next year and tell you how it went, because I could be completely wrong. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at a few things that you've seen before. I'm going to show you examples of PowerPoint. I have an example of a Keynote. I also have an example of a Haiku Deck, which we might skip the Keynote and just look at the Haiku Deck, because that's kind of fun and different. You don't see those very often. And then we're going to get into some others. I will show the Prezi so bear with me. I am going to show a Prezi today at Cali. And it might make you seasick, because I'm still working on the zooming feature and making it work. But it's the best Prezi I've made so far. And it didn't make any of my students sick this year, and that's like 50 people. So really. And then I'm also even going to show things like what if you used a poster or some kind of a static image behind you while you talked about the legal research process. So what I'd like to do is look at these different types of visuals and just talk about how you can do them, what the arguments are for and against using them. I'm going to be a little bit harsh and say that with every criticism with these visual tools, if there's a criticism, it's because the speaker did something wrong. So any visual tool has been made to be a helpful tool in the classroom or in presentations, and if it's not working, it's something that you didn't do right with the visual. Because everything you do needs to be thought out carefully and thoughtfully. So we'll go ahead and get into it, and we will look at our linear slideware first. So things like PowerPoint, Keynote, Haiku Deck, Slide Idea, there's all sorts. Google Slides, all of them are linear. So before we get into it, let's talk about a few of the criticisms, because there's a lot of PowerPoint haters out there. First of all, it's the idea that linear slideware is too linear, and most of our concepts are not something that happens this, then this, then this, then this, right? In the legal research process, I could start with statutes and then go to cases. I could start with cases and then go to statutes. We always argue that you start with secondary sources, right? So you can go all sorts of different ways. So how do I convey this choose your own destiny process through a linear format? Well, you can use conventions like the smart art that they have built right into PowerPoint. A lot of people don't use smart art, but if you do, it's shapes and diagrams that help you convey specific types of relationships. And this is a very basic PowerPoint I'm going to show you. I don't use animations or anything. I try to keep things simple and to the point. And so I really do like using smart art, which, I mean, at least at our school, not a lot of people seem to have grasped onto yet. So if you use something like that, you can make your point very simply without having to put a lot of time into it, but being thoughtful of what you are trying to convey. Reading your PowerPoint slides, we all know that's a bad idea. I always thought it was just kind of bad practice, but as it turns out, it actually doesn't help students learn very well. And it seems kind of counterintuitive to me, but if you read your slides to someone, they actually learn less well than if they're able to read what you have on the slides while you're talking and speaking different words. So it's called redundancy, which makes sense because it is in fact redundant for me to read something that you are already reading. So don't do it, because apparently it does actually impede your education if people are reading slides to you. But yeah, again, so these are all coming down to problems that speakers are having with the technology, not that the technology is causing for the speaker, if that makes any sense. So we'll go ahead and look and see some examples of smart art, just in case you haven't looked at it before. Or we might not if it decides not to load. We'll see. All right, we'll let you think about that for a second. And then, similarly, if you were to look at something like Keynote, now I am a Keynote novice, so my Keynote example, which this LibGuide is linked from my lecture description on the Cali website, so you're all welcome to look at it. What should be happening if this is loaded now is that this is a PDF version of the guide. I didn't want to waste time having the PowerPoint have to load every time or having to load the Keynote or anything. So since I'm talking about so many different formats, I thought I'd just throw them all up here and we could advance through like we would with a PowerPoint. So I always start my presentations the same way. I always start now with the big picture. Prezi actually taught me that. If I start with the big picture and then Prezi literally zooms into each of the issues and then zooms back out to the big picture, I think that helps bookend the presentation and really give them that you're always going to start and end with a big idea. And yeah, these are all going to just be examples of smart art. Some of it's very simple, some of it conveys more complex relationships. So I like this one for my primary sources and secondary source explanations because it helps me let them know that we recommend starting with secondary sources. Most attorneys I talk to start just with the primary, but you know that when you're researching in primary sources, something else might come up that you're confused about and you might have to go back to the secondary. So this particular smart art I enjoy because it does help you go back and forth and it shows that this is a nonlinear concept to convey. So yeah, these are some different examples. Cases are always a little bit hard for me to explain to people because it can just be a little overwhelming to think of all the different ways that you can find cases. So once again, I like to emphasize to my students that you want to use all these different approaches. You know, you find one case that you love, you're going to use all these approaches with it, and then you find another one through, you know, the citing decisions, and you want to start this all over again. So it's going to keep going, and then it's this fluid process, which is hard to convey visually. But I think with smart art, it may not be perfect, but it is a way to convey these relationships very well. And a diverse number of relationships. And so yeah, once again, so I always end with the big picture again. So I think, let's just skip the Keynote. You can look at the Keynote if you want. For the Keynote, I put in some images just to show that you don't have to use diagrams, you can use images. I was reading a study when I was getting ready for this presentation that looked at, and all of my resources, by the way, are in the last page of this guide, which we'll look at in a second. So if you want to see the articles that I've been reading, a lot of them are really quite interesting. So there's a little library for you on the end. So the interesting thing about this study was that they gave like a third of their lectures were just straight deliver lectures with no visuals. Then another third was a straight delivery with visuals that were completely irrelevant. So I don't know what they put up. They might have just put up pictures of kittens. You know, I have no idea. And then they did a third set of lectures that were completely very relevant images to whatever the speaker was talking about. And this was all in PowerPoint. And then they tested the students at the end, and they found that the students learned least from the ones with really irrelevant images. So I think in that case, the images were a little too distracting, and so they weren't able to absorb the information. They learned fine with the lecture delivery, straight lecture, no visuals, but they scored equally well with lecture delivery and visuals. So that might suggest that you really actually don't need visuals in the classroom and that this presentation is a waste of your time. However, when they asked the students what they preferred, they all preferred anything with visuals. They loved, you know, whatever the kittens were, or whatever irrelevant images, but they paid attention the best with the relevant images and the lecture. So it does actually matter what images you're using. I guess that's my point. And that's kind of why I'm not going to show the Keynote, because I was putting that, I will admit, I was putting this together at the last minute, the Keynote specifically, and I wasn't quite as thoughtful with the images as I could have been. Now, they were all slightly relevant images, which you can look at on your own, but they're not perfect. Is this going to be slow too? It's because it's the last day, isn't it? Have we worn out Harvard's guest Wi-Fi access? I think we have. There we go. Okay. So this is my first attempt at a Haiku Deck. So Haiku Deck, as it turns out, it's an app, and I've had it for a while, but I haven't really played with it. It's supposed to be mostly just big visuals and a few words. And it turns out that you can get to your Haiku Decks from the website as well. So that's what I've linked to here. And anybody that looks at my LibGuide can get to this Haiku Deck as well. So this would, again, be the same exact presentation. It's just using, you know, I don't know, can you guys see this image? It looks really dark up here, but can you see it? Okay, so what you should be seeing is a forest. So the idea is that my students need to see the forest through the trees, right? So that's my big picture that we'll see again at the end. These might be kind of silly images. Obviously, you're not using binoculars for issue spotting, but it's something that they might remember. It would be much more fun for me to use puppies or kittens, but these are all just images. It's very simple. It keeps the text down, which is kind of nice about Haiku Deck. You could do this the same way in PowerPoint, but Haiku Deck is specifically designed for it, and I kind of wanted to play around with it. And these are all just images that I found in Haiku Deck's database of images. So any that don't seem quite as relevant are because I didn't want to pay for their more expensive, slightly more relevant images. Okay, so just another example of using images that aren't, diagrams in your slideware. Okay, so that's probably enough about linear slideware. Are there any questions about PowerPoint or linear slideware at this point? Yes?
Ashley, can we maybe make a rule about limiting the use of cats in linear presentations?
I think there should be a rule.
Okay. I want you to make it. It'll be official.
I will. I will make that rule. I'm going to take a note. Okay. So now we're going to move on. There we go. So now let's talk about some nonlinear slideware, which in the slideware world is really, from what I can tell, just Prezi. But I'm also I'm going to loop Prezi in with mind mapping, because I think Prezi is it's kind of a bridge, if you will, just go with me, between linear slideware like PowerPoint and a mind map, because it does allow you to show a nonlinear process pretty well. But we know that the big problem with Prezi is the seasickness factor. I can't say that I've mastered that yet, but I know I've improved, and I know that the ways that you can improve are by changing the paths and moving the frames a little bit closer together so that it's not having to zoom as much. And you can pick different themes. The theme I have will just go up and down a few times. There are some that I've tried before that jump like all over the screen. That's going to make anybody sick, even if they don't naturally get seasick. And then any other criticisms about Prezi, I think can sort of be analogized to any other part of visual presentations, right? So I watched a Prezi one time that somebody just kind of got lost in, because if you're using a theme that does bounce all around, sometimes when you're zoomed in, you'll be able to see another part of your presentation, but it's not actually the next part you're going to. So I've seen a speaker think that she's going to that spot and then just get kind of flustered. So you do, with any technology, you want to know what's going to happen, and you don't have to be like really well rehearsed, but you want to have gone through it enough that you know what's coming next, even if it's not what looks like it's coming next. And it is also down to what you've chosen to use. So like I don't do ones that jump all over the place, because I got burned by that once, and I don't think those are well laid out enough. Although if you look at some of the TED Talks, they have really fantastic Prezis that are just like mind-blowing. So if you want to spend time learning how to use Prezi really well, you can do really incredible things with it. This is a very basic one. And it's very short. And my students really liked it. I think they mostly really liked it. Well, some of them I think just hadn't seen Prezi before, so there is the ooh and ah factor, right? Because it is very different than PowerPoint. You're not going to load either. Okay. We'll see, maybe we won't look at my Prezi. But I also know that it was the first time that I had really tried to convey the legal research process as a big picture. And I did have about 4 or 5 students from each of my sections come up afterwards and specifically thank me for that. So it's not really because of the Prezi, I don't think. I think it's because of the big picture. So I'm not advocating that you adopt Prezi. It's not for everybody. It may not even be for me. But it is a good conveyor of the big picture and helping you see how the different parts of your presentation fit together, or whatever concept you're teaching. So this is, again, it just zooms in to smaller parts. It allows me to talk about whatever I need to talk about. This is a very basic one. We all know you can embed video, you can embed audio. I could be hyperlinking to all sorts of things. But for mine, my students needed like a nice, no offense to my students who are lovely law students, but they possibly just because of the structure of our course and when I teach and how it's so spotty throughout the semester, they needed something basic and to the point and nothing too flashy or distracting. So again, same content, just put in a different visual format. And it's not, it's a little zoomy. I will admit to the zoom factor here. And then it goes back out to the big picture. And so if nothing else, I think Prezi does do a nice job of letting you know, I think, how a visual lecture should go. I really do think it should start with whatever your big picture is for that day, maybe even for your class. I mean, for mine, I only teach 4 times, so if I can start and end with the legal research process those 4 times, that's probably good. If it's a class where the professor teaches 3 times a week for an entire semester, I might get a little tired of looking at that same image twice. 6 times a week the entire semester? No, 9 times a week. No, 6 times a week? Okay, I'm going to stop trying to do math now because I'm nervous and I should keep going. Okay, so Prezi, everybody's seen it before. I would advocate to stop hating on Prezi, but don't use it if you don't want to. It's not for everybody. But if you're looking for something a little bit different than what you've been using, it's perfectly good to use, and there are ways to not make people sick with it. So far, everybody seems to be doing all right now. So see, I'm on a roll. All right, so now for something a little bit different. I haven't played with mind mapping a lot. This is one I hadn't heard about before. It's called CAGO. And it plays very nicely with Google, so they have a little app they've created that allows me to save my Kaggles into Google Drive. And since Google is taking over the world, it's always nice to find tools that work well with Google. So this is a very static one. I think you can find more interactive mind maps. I honestly don't know enough about the technology to know which ones to use, and some of the really, really nice ones you have to pay for, and I always enjoy things that I can get for free. So I wondered, what if I put a mind map up of the legal research process and then talk to my students about it? The nice thing about the mind map is it does allow me to be as interconnected as I want to be, right? It's just my brainstorm. This is what I consider to be the very basic legal research process, at least what my 1Ls need to know. So we don't get into admin until they hopefully take advanced legal research. We don't get into legislative histories until they take advanced legal research. We teach them statutes, cases, and a few key secondary sources. So, and then they have to know how to start and when to stop. So I think this does a nice job of mapping it out. I think the big problem, if I put this up and then lectured to my 1Ls, is they would spend their entire time trying to interpret this, because it's not their mind map, this is my mind. So it may not make any sense to them. So I think instead, if you were going to use a mind map in the classroom, I would probably throw it up maybe at the end and let them know this is a resource, here's the link to it, as something to come back to if you're stuck when you get the client C file and you don't remember what I told you to do first. Or I actually had this, what I think would be kind of an awesome idea, is if you were doing a review class or you were finishing, a unit in your regular course, I think it would be really cool to really learn how to use CAGO well. I made this one in an hour, and it probably shouldn't have taken me that long. It's very easy to use. So if you came in and made this with your class, it would be a class mind map, and I think that would be incredible, and I think the students would remember it really well. It would keep the class interactive, which is another common complaint about visuals in the classroom, is that instructors tend to let the visuals speak for them, and they forget to, be Socratic with the students or have class dialogues. Again, that's the speaker's fault. You have to remember to engage your students. So if you did this with your students, I think they'd remember it really well. It would be something that would make sense to them, and they'd remember to come back to it when they're studying. And I think you could do that a little less with the legal research process, although I'm thinking about seeing if my professor would let me do this in her class or not, because I think it would be a lot of fun. But I think it would be great in a doctrinal class, especially if you're doing, a lot of our professors will do, like the first week of exams, they'll do a review session or something. This would be a great tool to use. So food for thought. And if you want to learn a little bit about other mind mapping tools, there are a lot of articles that I have linked to that talk about all sorts of different mind mapping options for you. Okay, and then the last group of visuals I wanted to talk about are more static visuals, which mind maps could fit into as well, but I wanted to lump them with Prezi, so there you have it. So this would be like a poster or a LibGuide. As you can see, I enjoy using LibGuides in presentations. I don't really use them in lectures as much, but we'll talk about LibGuides in a second. So after thinking about mind maps, I thought, well, what if, there we go. What if I created a poster and just printed it out or just flashed it on the screen and talked? I think the same problems would come up that come up with mind maps or any other static image. Well, with a mind map, I think you'd be more confused. This is pretty straightforward. So it wouldn't take too long to read this and then come back to listening to me. But I think the big problem with a static image in a lecture is students are going to tune it out after a while. And so if you need the visual to activate the right brain, if they're going to tune it out, then you don't have that optimized educational process going on anymore, because the right brain has kind of shut down and it's gotten tired of the visual. So I think there's something to be said for visuals that keep changing in the classroom. Now, they don't have to do a lot, that you don't want it to be too distracting. If you were in Jill's lecture a couple hours ago, yeah. You know that you can use animations very well. You can do them very thoughtfully. You can also overdo them very easily. So you don't want to distract your students by doing anything that's flashy just for the sake of being flashy. Everything you do in a visual needs to be very thoughtfully put together. Okay, and then LibGuides, whatever pronunciation you subscribe to, or any other research guide website you might create for a class. They can be used in lectures. I really do like using them for presentations, especially if I have a lot of things to show, because it's a nice way to just throw it all into one place. And it becomes a mobile handout for anybody to come back to later. We haven't really used them in class because it is best practice to put visuals into your LibGuides, but they do tend to be a little wordier. They're going to have a lot of bulleted lists. Ours are kind of not a replacement, another option for the paper handout that our students, I'm sure, throw away after class. I'm not all that naive. But we do have guides, so what I like to do is I think the LibGuide is a great tool to throw up at the end of the lecture. You know, you finished what you're talking about and you say, okay, client C is coming up. Here's what you need to remember about finding cases. You know, I had 35 minutes to give this lecture today. We had to go really fast because it's not 35 minutes for me to just talk about the theory behind finding cases. You know, I have maybe 5 minutes to talk about that, and then I have to go do web demos of Lexis and Westlaw and Bloomberg. So it goes really fast. So if I can remind them through what I believe is a well-organized research guide, this is something that I ask them to come back to afterwards. I don't want them to spend time reading all of this while I'm in class. I want them to have something to come back to afterwards that pretty much addresses everything I said, probably in better detail than I was able to get to in my lecture. So that would be an example of a visual that I think is great in the educational process. I just don't think I would recommend it necessarily as your lecture supplement. Okay. So then just a few concluding remarks. I'm like way ahead of schedule. That is so rare for me. I love it. Okay. So what's interesting is that our peer disciplines like business and medicine, they've been using visual aids in the classroom for decades, and they all jumped on board. So, well, I'm assuming I didn't actually go to business school or medical school, but from what I can tell, it's used much more heavily. Visual aids are used much more heavily in the educational process there than they are in law. In addition, anymore, you're going to see a lot more visuals in legal practice. It's not that uncommon for an attorney to use a PowerPoint in her opening and closing arguments in court. So if they're using visual aids to educate their jurors or the judge, then maybe we should be using them in the classroom as, you know, maybe not as a tool of, okay, kids, you need to be using these in your legal practice, but just to get them the idea that visual aids are a powerful tool in education. And if we're not showing them, then they may not think to show them. And they may not expect to be using them. So I think, you know, if our students are going to grow up to become attorneys that need to use visuals, and our peer institutions are using visuals, our peer disciplines are using visuals, then I think it's time that we start using them a little bit more as well. But remember that I see absolutely no problem with using PowerPoint or Prezi or whatever your visual aid of choice is. All the criticisms you hear are from the worst cases of using them. So look for good examples of using them. Look for ways that it's done right. And always remember that you have to figure out how you're going to use your visual, what you think it's going to be used well for. So, like I said, I love using LibGuides and presentations at conferences. I don't really like using them in lectures. I prefer to throw them up as a study aid afterwards, for them to have something they can come back to. And the great thing about a LibGuide or something that lives on the web is it's something they can come back to, 10 years down the line when they've been practicing for a while, and well, hopefully by then they've mastered the legal research process. But okay, maybe as a summer associate or something, when they're far away and they don't want to call in because they're too embarrassed. It's something that they can come back to in practice. So I've already addressed this. You do need to make sure your visual fits your need. And there are going to be some lecture topics that they don't need visuals, and if you don't need a visual, that's fine. Or if you just want to draw on the chalkboard, go for it. But do something, because there are learners that do need it. The visual learners do learn better with visuals. And everybody functions better with a visual. You need to stimulate the right brain if you want to optimize their learning. So I think that's about all I have to say. I'm just going to leave you with that quote, but I will take questions now. Questions? Yes?
I saw something about PictoChart. I don't know what that is.
Oh, PictoChart. I'm sorry, I should have told you that. So PictoChart is an infographic creator. I was going to talk about infographics specifically, so thank you for bringing that up. Infographics tend to be those really long scrolling ones. You probably don't want that in a classroom because you're going to have to keep scrolling it up, and it just might be a little too distracting. It's too much. It's probably too distracting, honestly, for the teacher than it is for the students. But it's an infographic designer. The one that I used is called Canva, and it's really great. And you can create additional pages of your posters. And it also creates, it creates Facebook cover photos for you. It has all sorts of different things that you can make. But the nice thing about that is if you did want to use the poster layout, because they have a lot of, it's very easily customizable. And you can create, really nice visuals that you can't necessarily create as well in maybe a PowerPoint. So if you wanted to use that, you could add more pages, and then you can advance them almost like a PowerPoint. So yes, thank you for that question. Yes?
So I'll just throw this out there because you mentioned it. For mind mapping, MindJet Mind Manager is by far the most robust product.
Okay.
It does cost money, but the trick is sign up for a trial, and then they will offer you a greatly reduced rate, like 50% off the top of my head. I want to say making it maybe around $20, but you can do some pretty amazing stuff with it. I had a contracts teacher 11 years ago who actually used probably the first version of it and kind of did some of the stuff that you were talking about. I've never heard of anyone else doing it, so I don't know, but we all loved it.
Okay, great. So anyone watching this at home, she's recommending MindJet as a very good mind mapping software to use. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes?
We use as a source for images.
I'm sorry?
A source for images, what's your favorite source?
Oh, I kind of like to create my own images if I can. But I do use the Flickr Commons quite a bit. Or I'll do even just a Google image search, and you can ask it to filter by license. So that's always kind of the way I go. Now the problem with that is I am pretty uncategorically unwilling to pay for any images. I don't pay for stock photos. If I wanted that, I would just make my own. So because of that, sometimes I can be limited. So if you want a really relevant image, you may not get that necessarily, depending on what you're looking for. But yeah, Flickr Commons is probably the best place to go. Yes?
Anytime you're using Flickr, I had wondered a couple things in the Twitter thing earlier because that came up in Jill's presentation at night as well. You can search for government images, which you don't have to cite people, which is helpful. With Flickr Commons, please do make sure you're actually citing the source. That's what the person putting it out has requested. That's all they requested.
great, thank you. Yes?
She said what I was.
Oh, okay. Any other questions?
So
Yes?
there's also the noun project, if you
The
just kind
noun
of want
project.
a very basic static kind of icon image for something.
Ah,
And it has various, some of them you pay per image, but a lot of them are free just with attribution.
okay,
It's pretty excellent.
okay. That was the noun image, which I'm repeating because I may have to,
Noun project.
oh, I'm sorry, the noun image, is that what I said? Great. The noun project, I'm mostly saying that for my own benefit because I'm probably going to forget it later, so I may have to look at my own presentation and remember this. Thank you. Any other questions? Great, well, we are like 12 minutes ahead, no, 17 minutes ahead of time, so stretch, but come back here and find out who wins the Tetris lamp and the iPads and everything. Thank you.